The war felt routine, until they unleashed humanity's true fury. Part 1, just another Tuesday. The Kreth battlecruiser moved through the debris field slowly, like it had nowhere to be and nothing to fear. It probably didn't. Commander Velkin stood at the wide observation window and watched the broken pieces of another human outpost float past in the silence of space. Chunks of metal. Twisted support beams. A child's toy, somehow still intact, spinning slowly in the dark. He had stopped noticing things like that years ago. His second officer, Drac, stood beside him with a data slate, tapping through the numbers. Third human colony this cycle, Drac said. Resistance lasted approximately 11 minutes. They fired back, of course. One of their mining vessels attempted to ram our forward shields. Velkin made a low sound in his throat. It was something between a sigh and a click. In Kreth body language, it meant bored. They always do, he said. That was the honest truth about fighting humans. They were the most unpredictable species in the known galaxy. They would charge when any sensible being would run. They would shout into open communications channels when silence was clearly smarter. They would take a mining ship, a cargo freighter, or once, in a moment that had actually made Velkin sit up straight, a pressurized fuel tanker with a manual detonator, and throw it at a Kreth warship worth 100 times its value. And then they would die. And the next outpost would fall. And everything would continue exactly as before. 6 years. The Kreth Dominion had been at war with humanity for 6 years. In that time they had taken 43 human colonies, 17 orbital stations, and a wide stretch of the outer Perseus arm that was full of the kind of minerals the Dominion needed for its next generation of warships. Human governments had made speeches at the Galactic Conclave. Human admirals had issued declarations full of fire and anger. Human soldiers had fought with a wild and furious energy that was, Velkin admitted privately, genuinely impressive in the way that a burning building is impressive, bright, loud, and ultimately temporary. But none of it had changed anything. The war had a rhythm now. It felt like work. Good, productive work, but work. The Dominion's strategic analysts filed reports. The conquest proceeded on schedule. Velkin ate his meals, reviewed his orders, and slept without difficulty. He was a being at peace with his profession. Far across the same star system, on a battered human frigate called the UES Caldwell, Lieutenant Aaron Bryce was not at peace with anything. Aaron was 26 years old and had joined the Colonial Defense Forces at 19, which meant he had spent more of his adult life at war than not. He had a narrow face, tired eyes, and the habit of chewing on the end of his stylus when he was thinking hard about something. He was sitting in the cramped sensor bay of the Caldwell, watching the heat signatures from Farpoint 7 fade on his display, and he was thinking very hard. Farpoint 7 had been a small outpost. 300 civilians, mostly miners and their families, plus a garrison of about 60 soldiers. Aaron had known 2 of those soldiers by name. He had shared a meal with one of them at a supply station 8 months ago. He could not remember exactly what they had talked about, but he remembered that the men had laughed easily and had strong opinions about coffee. The heat signatures finished fading. The display went cold. They didn't even slow down, said Petty Officer Diana Cole from the seat next to him. She was 29, sharp-eyed, with short hair she kept tucked behind her ears when she was focused. Her voice right now was flat. Not broken. Just flat, the way a voice gets when it has already done its breaking in private. They never do, Aaron said. Diana reached across and pulled up a message that had come in 12 minutes ago, flagged in Priority 1 read. She had already read it. She held it out to Aaron without explaining it, because she figured the words would do the explaining on their own. Aaron took it and read it. Then he read it again, more slowly. The message did not come from Fleet Command. It did not come from the Joint Colonial Defense Council or any of the military bodies Aaron reported to. The routing code at the top belonged to an office he had heard of only once before, in a conversation that had taken place in a very quiet corner of a bar on shore leave, between people who spoke in low voices and stopped talking when anyone walked too close. The office had a long official name that took up several lines and meant very little. Its informal name, the only name that people who knew about it actually used, was the Cradle. Aaron set the tablet down carefully, as if it might break. "They're activating it," he said. Diana nodded. She didn't look relieved. She didn't look hopeful. She looked the way a person looks when a door they were told would stay closed for as long as possible has just opened, and they are no longer sure whether what is on the other side is salvation or something else entirely. "Get the captain," Aaron said. Captain Louise Farrow arrived at the sensor bay 7 minutes later. She was 41, with short brown hair going gray at the temples and the kind of face that had stopped trying to hide what it was feeling because it had learned that nothing hid anything from the people around her anyway. She was not a dramatic person. She did not make speeches unless she had to. She was the kind of officer her crew trusted not because she inspired them, but because she had never once let them down in a situation that counted. She read the message from the cradle. She read it standing up, one hand braced against the doorframe. When she finished, she was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said finally. "What does it mean?" Diana asked, even though she already had a guess. "It means we have a meeting to get to," Louise said. "And it means things are about to change." She looked at the cold display where Farpoint 7 used to be. Something moved behind her eyes, not grief exactly, but something in the same family. "Get me a course to coordinate Sierra 79. And tell the crew to get some rest if they can. 36 hours from now, rest is going to be hard to come by." She left without saying anything else. Aaron sat with the display in front of him for a while after she was gone. The debris from Farpoint 7 was still out there, slowly spreading across the system in all directions, the way wreckage always did. Given enough time, some of it would drift into orbit around a nearby moon. Some of it would fall into the gravity well of the system's star and burn. Some of it would keep moving outward, past the edge of the system, into the long dark between stars. He thought about the soldier who had laughed easily and had strong opinions about coffee. He thought about the word activating and what it meant. He had heard stories, the kind of stories people told when they were 3 drinks in and feeling either brave or reckless, about what humanity had actually been doing for the past 5 years while the war kept going the way it kept going. He had not believed most of those stories. They were too large. Too patient. Too unlike everything he knew about how governments and militaries worked. But the routing code on that message had been real. And Captain Farrow's face had been real. And the cold display in front of him was very, very real. Aaron Bryce chewed on the end of his stylus and thought about what it might mean that this war, which had felt, for a long time, like something humanity was simply enduring, might be about to become something else. Outside the hull of the Caldwell, in the silence of space, the wreckage of Farpoint 7 kept drifting. And somewhere at the coordinates marked Sierra 79, something was already waiting. #The war felt routine, until they unleashed humanity's true fury. Part 2, what was sleeping in the dark? The UES Caldwell moved through the dark at full burn, and no one on board slept very well. They all knew something was coming. They could feel it the way sailors in old stories felt a storm before the clouds arrived, something in the air, something in the quiet. Word travels fast on a small ship, and the word that was traveling was cradle, spoken in low voices, usually followed by a long pause and a look that said the speaker was not sure what to do with the information. Captain Louise Farrow spent the 36 hours doing what she always did when she was thinking hard. She worked. She read reports, she reviewed supply inventories, she walked the ship from one end to the other at least twice, stopping to talk to crew members she passed. Not about anything important. Just talk. How are you sleeping? Have you eaten? What is the situation with the port engine coupling that Vera mentioned 3 days ago? The ordinary business of keeping a ship and its people functional. But her mind was somewhere else. She had been given a briefing file to read during the journey. It was marked with a classification level she had never seen before and did not previously know existed. She read it alone in her quarters with the door locked, and she read it slowly, and when she was finished she sat still for a long time without moving. Lieutenant Commander Paul Heston knocked on her door an hour later. He was tall, careful in the way he moved, and had been her executive officer for 3 years. He was good at reading her silences. "How bad is it?" he asked. "It is not bad," she said. "That is the strange part. It is not bad at all." She turned the data tablet over in her hands. "You will read the full briefing when we arrive. But I will tell you this much, for 5 years, while we have been fighting this war the way we have been fighting it, there were people doing something else entirely. In the Jovian shipyards. In the Kepler belt. Above Mars, in dry docks that civilian satellites were quietly redirected to avoid. Paul waited. They were building, Louise said. Not a reserve fleet. Not a backup. Something with a different purpose behind it entirely. Paul was quiet for a moment. How much bigger? Louise told him the number. He sat down in the chair across from her without being invited, because his legs seemed to need the chair more than he needed to maintain formality. He looked at the table for a while. That is not possible, he said. The economic output alone would require. Yes, Louise said. It would. And they did. The thing that people did not understand about the 5 years of losses was that they were not simply losses. Every colony that fell, every ship that was destroyed, every engagement that ended badly, all of it had been recorded, analyzed, and used. Not in the operational sense of studying a battle to do better next time, though that too. In a deeper sense. Humanity's governments and military planners had made a decision sometime in the second year of the war that was so counterintuitive, so difficult to explain to the public, that it had never been explained to the public at all. They had decided to let the Kreth feel like they were winning. Not entirely. The colonial defense forces were still fighting hard, still doing everything they could with what they had. But the real effort, the manufacturing, the research, the shipbuilding, the development of weapons based on 6 years of direct combat data, all of that had been kept away from the front line. Hidden. Protected. Allowed to grow in the dark the way something grows when it is not disturbed. The plan had a name inside the cradle. The name was not dramatic. It was simply called the patient option, which was, in its own way, more frightening than any dramatic name could have been. Chief Engineer Vera Okafor read her portion of the briefing file 12 hours into the journey and then climbed up through the maintenance shaft to the secondary engine room, where she did her best thinking, and stood there for a while holding a wrench she did not need. Vera was 44, solid and steady, with hands that were permanently stained with engine compound and a mind that worked best when it had something concrete to hold onto. The numbers in the briefing file were not concrete. They were too large to be concrete. They floated in her head like something from a science fiction story, not from real life. She had always assumed, in the way that people assume things without really examining them, that humanity was simply outmatched. That the Kreth were bigger and older and more experienced and that the war would end the way it seemed to be ending, slowly, grinding, with humanity giving ground until there was no ground left to give. She had not liked this assumption. But she had believed it. The numbers in the file said she had been wrong. She climbed back down the maintenance shaft and found Aaron Bryce in the corridor outside the mess hall, eating something from a foil packet with the expression of a man who was not tasting what he was eating. "You read it?" she asked. "My section," he said. "Sensor and detection systems." He looked at the foil packet. They have been testing a jamming array that can blind Kreth long-range sensors across an entire star system simultaneously. Vera looked at him. Simultaneously, he repeated, in case she had missed the word. They stood in the corridor for a moment, both of them understanding something that was difficult to put into words. For 6 years, the war had felt like something being done to humanity. An outside force, pressing in, and humanity pressing back as hard as it could, which was never quite hard enough. The briefing file described something different. It described a war that had 2 layers, the visible layer, which the Kreth could see, and the invisible layer, which they could not. And the invisible layer had been growing and growing and growing for 5 years in the dark. Petty Officer Diana Cole, who had grown up on a colony planet and had lost her hometown to a Kreth raid in the 3rd year of the war, read her portion of the briefing file in one sitting, without stopping. When she finished, she did not feel what she had expected to feel. She had expected anger, the useful, focused kind she had learned to carry with her like a tool. Instead, she felt something quieter. Something that took her a while to identify. It was the feeling of a plan making sense. Not relief. Not joy. Just the specific, quiet feeling of understanding that the long, terrible thing you had been living through had a shape you had not been able to see before, and that the shape was not random, and that it was not hopeless, and that what looked from the outside like defeat was, from the inside, something that had a different name. She sat with that feeling for a long time. The UES Caldwell arrived at coordinates Sierra 79 with 4 hours to spare. Louise brought the ship out of faster-than-light travel, and the first thing every crew member saw on every display on the ship was the same thing: ships. Human warships, hanging in the dark in neat formations that stretched across the system as far as the sensors could read. Ships of types none of them recognized. Ships with drive signatures that were larger than anything in the fleet registry. Ships that looked, on a sensor display, less like a fleet and more like a fact, something settled and immovable, placed there not by urgency but by decision. Vera Okafor stood on the bridge and looked at the display and made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob and was perhaps both at once. Paul Heston counted the ship signatures on the tactical display for a while, then stopped counting because the number had become difficult to hold in his head. Aaron Bryce stared at his sensor readouts and thought about 4.7, and the cold display, and the soldier who had laughed easily, and the word activating. Diana Cole said nothing. She pressed her fingers flat against the sensor console, as if she needed to feel something solid, and she looked at all those ships, and she breathed. Louise Farrow stood at the center of her bridge and looked at the fleet that humanity had been secretly building for 5 years while the war felt like something being lost. She allowed herself, very briefly, to feel something. Then she opened a channel to the Fleet Command ship and said, "UES Caldwell, reporting for duty." The response came back immediately, "Welcome to Task Force Irongate, Captain. We have been waiting." The war felt routine, until they unleashed humanity's true fury. Part 3, the shape of what was coming. Admiral Nathan Cross was not a tall man, and he was not a young man, and he did not look like the kind of person who had spent 11 months designing something that might change the outcome of a war. He looked like someone's grandfather, round-faced, a little heavy, with reading glasses he was always misplacing and a habit of drinking tea that had gone cold without noticing. He had kind eyes that saw everything. He had been given command of Task Force Irongate 14 months ago. In that time he had not slept more than 5 hours on any given night, and he had read, by his own count, more than 9,000 pages of combat reports, sensor logs, battle analyses, and historical records. He had read reports about the fall of every human colony. He had read the last transmissions of ships that did not survive their engagements. He had read, and read, and read, because he believed with the whole of his mind that every piece of information was a small piece of a larger shape, and that if he looked at enough pieces for long enough, the shape would become clear. It had taken him 4 months to see it. He brought the senior officers of Task Force Irongate together in the briefing room of the flagship, a ship called the Unbroken Will, which was the largest vessel in the fleet and possibly the largest human-built warship that had ever existed. The briefing room could hold 200 people. It was full. Louise Farrow sat near the back, between Paul Heston and Vera Okafor. She had her hands flat on the table in front of her. The room was very quiet. Cross stood at the front and did not use dramatic language and did not make the kind of speech that people would quote afterward. He explained what they were going to do the same way a builder explains what a house is going to look like, clearly, carefully, with attention to which pieces connected to which other pieces, and why. The core of it was this: the Kreth fought well because they knew how humans fought. 6 years of combat had taught them. They had catalogued human tactics, human emotional patterns, human decision-making under pressure. They knew that humans charged. They knew that humans got loud and angry and aggressive. They knew that when a human fleet was under pressure, it would push forward into the source of that pressure rather than retreat from it. They had built their whole defensive and offensive doctrine around what they expected humans to do. Cross had spent 11 months designing a battle plan built on a single idea: do not do what they expect. It sounded simple. It was not simple. It required 412 warships to behave in ways that were so precisely coordinated that the plan had 17 separate contingencies for things going wrong, and each contingency had sub-contingencies, and the whole thing was cross-referenced into a document so dense that Cross had printed a physical copy, and the physical copy was 11 centimeters thick. He kept it on his desk. He had read it so many times that the edges of the pages were soft. The new ships, the ones built in secret over 5 years, had been designed specifically for this battle plan. Not designed to match Kreth warships, but to exploit what 5 years of combat data had revealed about Kreth weaknesses. Their communications architecture, for instance, the invisible network that allowed Kreth fleets to function as a coordinated whole rather than as individual ships, was sophisticated but brittle at its relay nodes. Destroy the right nodes in the right order, and a Kreth fleet went from an organized machine to a collection of individual ships making individual decisions, which was significantly less dangerous. Human engineers had spent 2 years building weapons specifically designed to find and destroy those nodes. Louise listened to all of this and understood, piece by piece, what the last 6 years had actually been. It was a strange feeling. She had lived through those 6 years. She had made decisions in those years that cost people their lives, and she had carried those decisions as weight, as she was supposed to. Now she was being asked to understand that those years had also been something else, a long, painful, expensive education that humanity had been conducting while also fighting the war. Losing ground to buy knowledge. Giving up colonies to understand an enemy. She was not sure how she felt about that. She filed the feeling away to examine later, when there was time. After the briefing, she walked the Unbroken Will's observation deck for a while. The ship was enormous. Walking from one end to the other took 20 minutes at a steady pace, and she was barely into it when she stopped and looked out at the fleet spread across the dark outside. 412 ships. Crew members numbering in the hundreds of thousands. All of it built in secret while the visible war happened. She thought about what the Kreth must be seeing on their sensors right now, if they were seeing anything at all. Their long-range patrols extended to the edge of the system, but the fleet was parked well outside standard patrol range, and the jamming array Aaron had described was already active, softening the edges of whatever signals might otherwise have reached a Kreth scanner. The Kreth were not seeing this. Not yet. Commander Velkin was, at that moment, on his patrol route and experiencing something he would not have been able to name precisely, a mild, background unease. Not fear. Not even concern, exactly. More like the specific feeling of a pattern not quite matching up. He had been patrolling this sector for 3 weeks, and something about the human activity in the outer system felt slightly different from what the models predicted. Not dramatically different. Just a shade off. Their cargo traffic was lighter than expected. Their communication signals were fewer. The mining operations in the outer asteroid belt had gone quiet in a way that did not match the seasonal extraction schedule. He mentioned it to Drac, who reviewed the data and concluded that there were several routine explanations and that no escalation of alert status was warranted. Velkin agreed. He was not the kind of officer who raised alarms without cause, and the data did not yet constitute cause. He returned to his scheduled patrol. He ate dinner. He reviewed the next cycle's orders. The unease did not go away. He noted it in his personal log, which was a habit he had maintained for 20 years of service. He described it carefully, the way he described everything, precisely, without embellishment. There is something wrong with the pattern, he wrote. I cannot identify what. I will continue to monitor. He closed the log entry and went to sleep. Back on the Unbroken Will, Nathan Cross sat in his small office with his 11-centimeter thick battle plan and his cold tea and his reading glasses, and he went through the plan one more time. He had given the order 4 hours ago that set the execution clock running. In 18 hours, Task Force Irongate would begin moving. In 22 hours, they would arrive at the edge of the Cauldron system, which was the system Velkin was currently patrolling and which was also the location of 3 Kreth capital ships, 2 support cruisers, and a forward command post that the Dominion's strategic architecture depended on more than it knew. Cross had not chosen Cauldron because it was the easiest target. He had chosen it because of what winning there would do to Kreth logistics across 5 connected systems, and because of where Velkin's fleet was positioned relative to 3 gravitational bodies that would play a specific role in Hour 11 of the engagement, and because a complete and visible victory at Cauldron would reach every Kreth commander in the region at once. He had chosen Cauldron because the Kreth had been winning there for years without difficulty, which meant their guard was low and their patterns were deep and their habits were exactly as entrenched as he needed them to be. Cross found his reading glasses on top of the battle plan, where he had left them. He put them on. He drank his cold tea. He turned to Contingency 7 and read it again, slowly, because Contingency 7 was the one he thought about most often, the one that covered the scenario in which the first 2 hours went wrong, and he wanted to make sure he still believed it would work. He did. He closed the plan. He looked at the small photograph he kept on the corner of his desk, his daughter, taken on her wedding day, 3 years ago, on a colony planet that the Kreth had taken 8 months later. She was safe. She had evacuated in time. But the planet was gone, the way 43 planets were gone, and Cross thought about that every day, not as fuel for anger but as fuel for focus. He turned off the light. He lay down on the small couch in his office. He did not sleep, but he rested, and resting was enough. In 18 hours, everything would begin. The war felt routine, until they unleashed humanity's true fury. Part 4, the hour the war changed. The Kreth sensor officer saw it first. He was a young officer named Treth, barely 2 years out of academy training, and he was on the night watch because night watch was what junior officers got. He was not expecting anything unusual. The system had been quiet for weeks. He was halfway through a logistical summary that was so routine it was practically a sleeping aid, and then his display changed. He blinked. He recalibrated. He ran a diagnostic. The diagnostic confirmed that the instruments were working perfectly. He ran another diagnostic because he did not trust the first one. The second diagnostic said the same thing. He called his senior officer. Commander Velkin arrived on the bridge within 4 minutes, still pulling on the top half of his uniform. He looked at the display. He looked at it for a long time, the same way a person looks at a piece of writing that is in a language they know but is saying something that does not connect with anything they have previously understood. There were ships at the edge of the system. Human ships. Not the small, battered vessels that his fleet usually engaged, the frigates, the patrol ships, the desperate little craft that humans threw at Kreth forces and which always lost. These were different. They were large. They were numerous. And they were moving with a slowness that felt wrong, because human ships did not move slowly. Human ships charged and screamed and burned bright and died fast. That was the pattern. That was what 6 years of war had taught every Kreth officer in the fleet. These ships were not charging. They were deploying. There is a difference. A charge is a feeling turned into movement, fast and loud and impossible to ignore. A deployment is a machine settling into position, quiet, methodical, patient. The human fleet spread across the system like a hand opening, and it was so deliberate, so unlike anything Velkin had seen from a human force before, that for a moment he could not process it. Classification, he said. His voice was steady. He was trained to be steady. Treth's hands were not steady. We have no classification for most of these vessel types, Commander. They do not match any design in our records. He paused. The drive signatures are significantly larger than any registered human warship. Velkin counted. He stopped counting when the number exceeded what his mind wanted to hold. Contact Central Fleet Command, he said. Priority 1. What is the message, Commander? Velkin looked at the display. He thought about the unease he had written in his log. He thought about the cargo ships that had gone quiet and the mining operations that had stopped in the pattern that had been slightly wrong for 3 weeks. Tell them, he said, that we require immediate support. Tell them that the human fleet we are observing does not behave like any human fleet we have previously encountered. And tell them, he paused for just a moment, tell them that I believe we may have made a significant error in our assessment of this war. He sent the message. He was not sure Central Fleet Command would understand it in time. On the UES Caldwell, Aaron Bryce was watching the same deployment from the opposite direction, and he was not afraid. He had been afraid every day for 6 years. This was different. This was something he had no word for yet, so he sat with it and let it be unnamed and watched the sensor display as 412 human warships took up their positions. The Unbroken will fired first. Admiral Cross had chosen the opening shot himself, which was unusual for a flag officer, but Cross had particular ideas about symbolism, and the particular idea he had was that the first shot of the real war should come from the biggest gun on the biggest ship humanity had ever built. He wanted the Kreth to feel, in that first moment, that something fundamental had changed. The target was a Kreth dreadnought. It was called the Eternal Conquest of Realms, which was the kind of name that said something about how the Kreth thought about themselves and their place in the galaxy. It was 40 years old. It had served in 11 conquests. Its shields were rated against every known human weapon. They were not rated against this. The shot lasted less than a second. The Eternal Conquest of Realms lasted approximately 4 seconds after the shot landed, and then it did not exist anymore. In the place where it had been there was a cloud of heat and debris that expanded outward in all directions and then began to cool. Velkin felt it before his instruments confirmed it. Something in the way the light changed. Report, he said. The eternal conquest of realms has been destroyed, Treth said. His voice was very small. Velkin said nothing. He was processing. The dreadnought had been destroyed in a single shot from a weapon he had never seen fired before, and the weapon had come from a ship he had no record of in any Kreth database. He was being asked, in real time, to rebuild his understanding of what this war was. He had built that understanding over 6 years. He was being asked to rebuild it in seconds. The Kreth fleet did what the Kreth fleet was trained to do. It pushed forward. It engaged. Velkin ordered the advance because the orders were correct by doctrine and because there was no alternative doctrine for a situation that had never been anticipated. This was exactly what Nathan Cross had predicted, on page 1 of the battle plan, in the very first paragraph, which he had written first because he was sure of it before he was sure of anything else. The human fleet did not retreat. It did not scatter. Its outer wings folded inward in a motion that had taken 6 months of simulation to get right, and what the Kreth fleet advanced into was not a defensive line, it was a shape. A closing shape. A shape that had no name in the Kreth tactical vocabulary because no one had needed a name for it before. The UES Caldwell held the left flank with 7 other frigates, shielding 3 heavy cruisers that were doing something specific and important that would not make it into any of the dramatic accounts of the battle later. The cruisers were targeting the Kreth communications relays, the nerve network that allowed the Kreth fleet to function as one body rather than 100 separate ships. They were working through a list, methodically, the way you work through a list when the list is important and the order matters. Aaron ran the sensor bay. He did not eat for 9 hours. Diana Cole brought him something at hour 7 and he consumed it without looking at it. They tracked incoming fire. They fed targeting data to the cruisers. They noted the precise moment, at hour 6 and 40 minutes, when the first major Kreth communications relay went dark. After that, the Kreth ships began to hesitate. Not by much. They were too well trained to fall apart. But a hesitation in a warship is a very large thing, even when it lasts only a few seconds. A hesitation means a decision is not being made, and in combat, decisions not made are opportunities lost, and opportunities lost are ships destroyed. The human fleet drove into the hesitations. Velkin's ship was still fighting at hour 12. He had lost his sensor officer to a hull breach. He had lost his first officer to a console explosion. His port batteries were gone. He was running on secondary power and his shields were at 30% and he was watching the tactical display with the specific stillness of someone who has come to understand something important and is not sure what to do with the understanding. The humans were not charging. They were not screaming. They were not bright and loud and temporary. They were relentless. That was the word. Relentless. The human fleet moved through the engagement with a steadiness that felt less like fury and more like physics, like something that had weight and momentum and could not be stopped by wanting it to stop. Every time a Kreth ship found an opening and pressed it, there was a human response already prepared, already in position, already firing. Every time a Kreth formation shifted to adjust, the human fleet had already adjusted first. It was as if they had read the battle before it happened. In a way, they had. 11 months of planning, 6 years of data, and a man with reading glasses who drank cold tea and had read 9,000 pages of combat reports had seen this battle in his mind long before it happened in space. Every Kreth response had been considered. Every Kreth habit had been mapped. The plan was not perfect, no plan was, but it was close enough that the gaps were manageable, and the contingencies held. At hour 17, Velkin sent a second message to Central Fleet Command. It was shorter than the first one. It said, "We were wrong about them." He did not elaborate, because the data transmission accompanying the message said everything that elaboration could have added. Fleet Command received it and read it and called an emergency session of the War Council, and in that session someone said, for the first time in an official setting, the thing that everyone on the Kreth side had been privately beginning to think. The humans had been holding back. The session lasted a long time. In the Cauldron system, at hour 19, the battle ended. Not with a dramatic final shot. Not with a surrender message or a fleeing fleet. The remaining Kreth ships disengaged in good order, pulling back to the system's jump point, and the human fleet let them go because Cross had decided, months ago, that the point of Cauldron was not to destroy a fleet. The point was to break an assumption. Louise Farrow stood on her bridge and watched them go. She was very tired. She was the kind of tired that went into the bones and stayed for days. But she stood straight, and she watched the display, and she did not look away until the last Kreth signature disappeared into faster-than-light travel and the system was quiet. "Status report," she said. Paul Heston gave it to her. "Casualties. Damage. Systems." He read it steadily, and she listened steadily, and when he was done she said thank you, and meant it. "We held the flank," Vera said, from the engineering station. She sounded like she was still convincing herself it was true. "We held the flank," Louise agreed. The display showed a star system that had been a battle and was now a silence. Somewhere in that silence, the wreckage of ships, Kreth and human both, drifted outward in all directions. The debris would spread for years. Eventually, some of it would reach the edge of the system and keep going. Louise thought about 43 colonies. She thought about 6 years of loss and the weight of it. She thought about what it meant that they had not lost. "Not tonight. Set course for the rendezvous point," she said. "And tell the crew well done." She said it quietly, without ceremony, because it was true and because it did not need ceremony to be true. Outside the hull, the system was very still. The war felt routine, until they unleashed humanity's true fury. Part 5, what humanity wanted to say. The ceasefire message arrived 72 hours after the last ship left the Caldra system. It did not come through the usual diplomatic channels, because the usual diplomatic channels had been quiet for most of the war, full of strongly worded statements that changed nothing and appeals to the Galactic conclave that resulted in formal expressions of concern and very little else. This message came through a different channel. It was routed through a Kreth frequency that was normally used for emergency communications between fleet commanders and home government. Using that channel for a diplomatic signal was the equivalent, in human terms, of a general calling the president on a field radio and saying they needed to talk. Petty Officer Diana Cole was the one who received it on the Caldwell. She read it twice to make sure she understood what she was reading. Then she called Captain Louise Farrow, and she used the same flat, careful voice she had used when she described the fall of Farpoint 7, because the flat, careful voice was the one she used when she was holding something large very still inside herself. "It is a request for talks," Diana said. "Preliminary ceasefire terms. They want to negotiate." Louise was in her quarters. She was not asleep. She had not slept properly in 4 days, and her body had adapted to the situation by providing her with a shallow, restless version of sleep that covered the biological minimum without actually being restful. She sat up, turned on the light, and read the message on the tablet Diana sent through. She read it twice, like Diana had. Then she sat still for a moment. The message was careful. The Kreth did not apologize. Apology was not a concept their diplomatic language had a clean word for, but the message was careful in a way that communicated, to anyone paying attention, that the Dominion's War Council had met and had made a decision that required a significant recalibration of their public position. There were phrases in it that, when run through a standard translation filter, came out somewhat awkward. Louise thought about that. She thought about what it meant that a civilization which had been confidently expanding for 4 centuries was now searching for the right words. It meant Caldras had done what Cross intended it to do. She sent a reply acknowledging receipt and confirming that the communication had been forwarded to the appropriate authorities. Then she put the tablet on her nightstand and stared at the ceiling for a while. The thing about the ceasefire message was that it did not feel the way she had always imagined it would feel. For 6 years she had fought a war that she believed, on most days, would not end well for humanity. Not because she had given up, but because the math was difficult, and the math had never stopped being difficult until the night of Caldras. She had imagined that if a ceasefire ever came, it would feel like release, like a fist unclenching after a very long time. Instead it felt quiet. Ordinary. The way the end of most things feels when you are too tired to have the reaction you expected. She thought about the 43 colonies. She thought about the people who had lived in them. She thought about what came next, which was the harder thought. In the days that followed, while the first preliminary discussions began between human diplomatic teams and Kreth representatives at a neutral station agreed upon by both sides, Nathan Cross gave a briefing to the full command staff of Task Force Iron Gate. It was not a celebratory briefing. Cross did not do celebrations, or if he did, he kept them private and brief. This was a debrief, precise, detailed, focused on what had worked, what had not worked, what the 17 contingencies had actually been needed for, and what the next phase of the war would look like if the ceasefire did not hold. He believed it would hold. He said so once and then moved on, because his belief was based on analysis, and the analysis had been included in the briefing documents and people could read it there if they wanted the detail. What he spent the most time on was a single question that one of the younger captains asked near the end of the session. The captain was a woman named Kate Briggs, who had commanded a destroyer through the entire Battle of Caldress and had done it well, and who had a direct manner of speaking that Cross appreciated. She asked, "Why did they believe we were losing? For 6 years, they watched us fight. How did they miss what was being built?" Cross took off his reading glasses and held them in his hand. It was the gesture he made when he was about to say something he had been thinking about for a long time. "Because they saw what we showed them," he said. "The colonial defense forces fought hard and lost ground and kept fighting. From outside, that looks like a species at its limit. A species that is giving everything it has and still losing." He paused. The thing they never considered was that what they were seeing was not everything we had. It was what we chose to show them. The room was quiet. "The Kreth are very good at war," Cross continued. "They have been very good at war for a long time. And one of the things that happens when you are very good at something for a long time is that you stop questioning your assumptions about it. They assumed they understood humans because they had been fighting humans for 6 years. They had data. They had patterns. They had a model." He put his glasses back on. The model was accurate. It was just incomplete. Because the part of humanity they were modeling was the part we let them see. Kate Briggs nodded slowly. "We made ourselves legible to them," Cross said. "And then we changed the language." On the Caldwell, Louise Farrow called her senior officers together in the small briefing room and told them that formal ceasefire talks were beginning. She read the current diplomatic statement, which was measured and careful and did not make any promises about outcomes, because diplomatic statements never did when the outcomes were still being decided. Paul Heston asked what the likely terms would be. Louise said she did not know, but that the recovered colonies would be the central issue and that humanity's position had, for the first time in 6 years, the weight of a real military victory behind it. Vera Okafor asked a practical question about resupply and what the repair schedule for the ship's port batteries would look like given current fleet logistics priorities. Louise told her she would get an answer from fleet operations within the day, because Vera's practical questions always deserved practical answers. Aaron Bryce did not ask anything for a moment. He sat at the briefing table and looked at the surface of it, and then he looked up and asked the question that had been in the back of his mind since the battle ended. "What do we tell people? About the last 6 years? About the fact that," he paused, working out how to say it, "about the fact that part of the plan was letting the colonies fall." The room was quiet. Louise took a breath. "We tell them the truth," she said. "That it was not a plan anyone chose because they wanted to. That it was a plan people chose because the alternative was losing the war completely, and because the people who made those decisions believed that the only way to win was to be patient in a way that was very, very painful." She was quiet for a moment. "It will not be enough for some people. There are people who lost everything in those 43 colonies, and no explanation is going to be enough. We have to understand that and accept it." No one argued with that. Diana Cole said, quietly, "My hometown was one of them." "I know," Louise said. "I am not sure how I feel about it," Diana said. "I think I need more time." "That is fair," Louise said. "Take the time." The debriefing ended and people drifted out, back to their posts, back to the ordinary work of running a ship that was, for the first time in a long time, not in immediate danger of being destroyed. Aaron went back to the sensor bay and sat in his usual seat and looked at a display that was, for once, showing nothing alarming. Just the normal scatter of deep space, cosmic background, distant stars, the faint traces of the fleet around them. He sat there for a while, doing nothing in particular, which was itself unusual enough to feel strange. He thought about the word activating and what it had meant when he first read it in the sensor bay, with Farpoint 7 still cooling on the display. He thought about what it meant now. He thought about the fact that the war might actually end. Not in the way things sometimes ended, not in the tired, grinding, gradual way of something that simply ran out of energy, but in a real, formal way. A decided way. The way things end when one side has made a clear and undeniable point. Humanity had made its point. It had taken 6 years and 43 colonies and more loss than Aaron had words for, and it had made the point in 19 hours over a star system called Caldrus, with 412 ships that nobody had known existed and a battle plan 11 centimeters thick. The point was not, "We are stronger than you." The point was something quieter and more specific. The point was, "You thought you knew us. You were watching us for 6 years and you built a model and you were certain the model was right." And it was right, as far as it went. But it did not go far enough, because what you were watching was what we chose to show you, and what we were actually doing was something you never thought to look for. The point was, do not confuse patience with weakness. Do not confuse restraint with limit. Do not look at a people who are enduring something terrible and assume that endurance is the most they are capable of. Diana Cole appeared in the doorway of the sensor bay. She leaned against the frame and looked at Aaron and did not say anything for a moment. "Do you think they will actually stop?" she asked. "The Kreth. Do you think they will actually agree to terms?" Aaron thought about it honestly. "I think Caldrus scared them," he said. "Not because of the ships we had or the weapons we used, but because of what it proved about what we are." He looked at his display. "They spent 6 years fighting us and they thought they knew everything about us. And then they found out they were wrong. That's the thing that scared them. Not losing the battle. Finding out their model was wrong." Diana was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said. She pushed off from the doorframe and went back to her station. Aaron sat in the sensor bay, in the quiet, and looked at the unremarkable display, and thought about what it meant to be the kind of species that could hold something like this together for 5 years in the dark, the building, the waiting, the patience, the long sustained refusal to give up, and then release it, all at once, at exactly the right moment. He was not sure he had a word for it. He was not sure he needed one. Outside the hull of the Caldwell, space was very still, and the war that had lasted 6 years was beginning, slowly and carefully, to end.